Καλησπέρα σας. Σας καλωσορίζω στη δεύτερη δημόσια τηλεδιάλεξη που δίνει για το πρόγραμμά μας το πρόγραμμα ΠΝΥΚΑ, Πολιτική Ιστορία, Θεωρία και Πράξη του Ανοικτού Πανεπιστημίου Κύπρου, η δόκτορας Nino Tabeshadze, η γεωργιανή συνάδελφος, η οποία βρίσκεται αυτή την εβδομάδα του Απριλίου 2024 στο Ανοικτό Πανεπιστήμιο Κύπρου, στο πλαίσιο του προγράμματος Erasmus+, για μια σειρά 4 δημόσιων τηλεδιαλέξεων, 2 από αυτές για την ΠΝΥΚΑ και άλλες 2 αύριο και μεθαύριο για το πρόγραμμα Επικοινωνία και Νέα Δημοσιογραφία. Όπως είχαμε τη δυνατότητα να πούμε και χθες, η δόκτορας Nino Tabeshadze έχει διδακτορικό στις πολιτισμικές σπουδές, ασχολείται με διεπιστημονική έρευνα, με ζητήματα συλλογικού τραύματος, διαπολιτισμικών σχέσεων, είναι καθηγήτρια στη Σχολή Κοινωνικών Επιστημών του Γεωργιανού Ινστιτούτου Δημοσίων Υποθέσεων, Georgian Institute of Public Affairs, ενώ από το 2013 είναι και προσκεκλημένη καθηγήτρια στο Κρατικό Πανεπιστήμιο της Τυφλίδας με τον τίτλο Ιβάνε Τζαχασιβίλη. Είναι στην Σχολή Κοινωνικών και Πολιτικών Επιστημών. Είναι επίσης επίτιμο μέλος του World Museum, εκπροσωπώντας τη Γεωργία, ενώ ήταν υποψήφια το 2017 και για το βραβείο Τσιναντάλη στην κατηγορία της καλύτερης νέας ακαδημαϊκού της χρονιάς. Μετά από τη χθεσινή της διάλεξη που είχε τίτλο Impact of Cross-Cultural Communication on International Relations, σήμερα η Dr. Nino Tabeshadze θα μας μιλήσει με θέμα Development of Enemy Icon through speech. So, at this moment, I would like to give the floor, the microphone and the camera to Nino for her today's lecture. Dear Nino.
Thank you. Hello again. It's me again. So today we are going to speak about formation of the enemy icon through the Speech Act. Well, we count on the fact that mostly you already have an information about a lot of those things that we are going to speak about today. So in the basic sense, we are going to cover how the enemy icon is created from ordinary countries or from ordinary people, etc. For example, when you are, it is important in the sense that when the countries go into the war or when the countries start to have a conflict, they try to justify their conflict by saying that, okay, this person or this country or the leader of the country is my enemy, right? And that is a very interesting phenomenon because it is partially connected to the faulty communication or lack of cross-communicational, cross-cultural communicational, let's say, patterns or skills. Because as you remember, yesterday we have covered partially this issue, right? And we said that if you have cross-cultural communicational competence, then most probably you also know how to avoid conflicts because you are able to talk. You are able to understand the other's perspectives. Well, in today's lecture, we mostly are going to speak about what happens when one side of the communication side, let's say one party of the communication, is not ready to understand the other party during the communication. So, of course, conflicts happen. And we know that when we talk about the war, which is a very actual topic today because of the ongoing Ukrainian war, we know that the war is a full-scale military opposition, right, between two parties. It can be a civil war, for instance, you will know that. It can be a war between the countries or war inside the country between two ethnic groups, etc. But in every case, there is one thing that is common, and that's interesting to understand and see. Commonality most often is that both parties, those who fight with each other, call each other enemies, right? So it's also interesting, let's say, stigmatization and naming, because you would not fight with your friend, right? So you fight with someone or some land that you perceive as an enemy. Now, you might have a question, okay, how does that work? One day I wake up and I see an enemy, or how do I understand as a country's leader, as a diplomat, as ordinary citizen, who is my enemy? And today we are going to cover exactly that topic. How do we know that we are facing an enemy? Or who do we listen to? What do they say when they try to tell us, okay, this is our enemy, right? So today we are going to focus on how enemy is built, how the face of the enemy is created. Yes, exactly. Perceptions of us and the enemy, or our group and the other group. But the thing which Maria right now wrote, so I'm following your comments at the same time. So the thing is, in the us group, we have a bigger homogeneity. So we like each other. And we like each other, going back to yesterday's lecture, we like each other because we understand each other. We like each other because we speak the same language, we have the same cultural pattern, we like the same food, the same music, etc., right? But the others, so it's something like, when in ancient Rome, there was the notion of us and the barbarians, right? So all of us were good and barbarians were all of the others. Those were Ostrogoths, Visigoths, everyone, Franks. So it did not matter. So for the Roman Empire, for instance, there was no differentiation. Okay, those are barbarians. But inside the barbarians, there was a differentiation. So there were Franks who became France. There were Ostrogoths, there were Visigoths. So there were multiple different, barbarian types. But for Roman Empire, it did not matter. Everyone else was an enemy. Everyone else was the other. So an enemy is elevated other. It's something like, I can have a very big identification or self-perception. I am who I am. I am Westerner, I'm European, etc. And others are non-Europeans, for example, right? But then in the others, there are groups, and enemy is the biggest other. Let's say it's the most radical other that I do not like. I do not share their vision. I think they are occupants. I think they are bad. They have taken my land. They have killed the people, right? So there is a particular attempt, or, it can also be objective, right? But there is radicalization of the people. So there is radicalization of certain cultures and lands that takes place. And today we will be looking at the mechanism of that. We will be talking a lot about Georgian and Russian narratives after August War 2008, because that will help you understand how Russia is building its narrative and how Georgia is building its narrative. And you might, at the end of the lecture, start to think and maybe even understand that even today, in today's war situation, Russia's narrative stays the same. So Russia very rarely changes its first narrative, the template which they create for their people, and this template stays the same throughout many years now. So I think it will be interesting, especially for those who go into the communication and politics, right? And so first of all, the question, why should we study past? A lot of you, right, I always start with the questions. So it is because you need to understand, why is this lecture needed at all, right? So why can't I go and just, live with today or live in the present moment, which is a very fashionable concept, right? Well, the idea is that if you don't explore the past, you will never understand the present processes inside the country. And it also can tell you very well, and it can explain of who you are on the cultural level. And also shared experiences, memories, and values create this us group. So to tell you otherwise, if we don't learn past, we are condemned to repeat it. Didn't you ever have that, on the individual level? It's very easy to understand. And I would like to argue that countries and communities are not very far away from individuals, because countries and communities and societies are made up of individuals. So simple as that. So I don't know if you have ever had this situation, but for example, you have made a mistake in your life, right? And I'm sure that all of us have made a mistake. And then you did not exactly work through it. So you didn't exactly realize it. You didn't exactly analyze your behavior. So you just shut it down and you said, okay, whatever, I'm going to live with today. And then the next day, you might still make the same mistake. If not the next day, then maybe after 1 year, you might appear in the same exact situation, right? Philosophers call it often a circle. So if you don't work through your trauma, you might appear in the same circle again and again. Well, more scientifically, you can say that it is not only that moment, but it is also additionally the problem of not studying past correctly or not studying past at all. Oftentimes, people, and I would like to say it's also true for Georgia, and somehow I have a doubt that it might be true also for Cyprus, that when we speak about war or when we speak about some type of attention, people don't like to talk about it. They say, okay, they were bad, they have conquered us. End of story. So we are the ones that are innocent, they are the ones that are guilty. Now, if you go to the other side of the conflict and you will ask them what happened, most probably they can tell you, oh, we protected someone and they were attacking someone. So we are good, they are bad. So if we do not talk about the past in the objective and unbiased way to understand where were our mistakes, or maybe how our behavior was interpreted or how our behavior was, presented in the eyes of the world, we might never fix our mistakes in the future. And this might be, oftentimes this is, you will know it. It is called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but it is often that elder generation does not like to talk about conflicts. They say, okay, whatever happened, happened. End of story. But it's not so easy, because if we don't consider our past, we will never be able to overcome it, right? So then we will be so-called, Sigmund Freud, the father of psychology, called it a melancholic circle. So we will constantly be thinking, okay, like maybe that was a bad experience, and what if it happens again, and what if this and that, right? So that is absolutely true. I read now Lazarus' comment. Yes, and it's interesting that, it's not so important to be objective. It is interesting to see why people say what they say. Switching of the perspective is very important, because, for instance, I know that as Georgian, I will say always that we were victims, always, in every war, in Middle Ages, in modern years, in 20th century, in 21st century, in 2008, we were victims. But at the same time, I need to understand how our government or how our ideology uses that moment to make us saints when we are not saints. Similarly, for example, Russians say, oh, we defended Abkhazians and Ossetians who wanted the separatism. We defended them, right? So that is their, their ideology. But I'm not interested whether it is true or not that much, because I think it is not true, and that is my subjective point of view. But rather, objectively, I can see why do they say what they say. So where does it stem from? Is it only in the conflict of Georgia that they say that, or is it in every conflict? And if it is so, that means that there is some type of a logic that works for them, right, in their reality. And collective memory. So collective memory notion is very important. It is shared values, and that includes attempts of individuals, groups, also states, to define themselves by history interpretation, reflection of experience, and depiction of trustworthy events. Well, I would say that for Cyprus, it might be that it's, a cradle of civilization, right? This is a little bit concept that is shared by the majority of the Cypriots, that Cyprus is the cradle of civilization. I'm sure that you would read something like that in the Cypriot literature, right? Or in the textbooks, because collective memory works like this. Especially in politics and nationalism, you might study 5 Signs of How to Create a Nation. That is a wonderful author, Adam Smith, who created, he came up with the theory that there are 5 major things that create a nation. And one is to live on the same territory and then to speak the same language, which was partly covered yesterday. And the third is this one. Third is to have a collective memory. What does that mean on a basic level? For instance, when you study the history of Cyprus, you all study from the same history textbook, I reckon, in Cyprus, right? Which is endorsed by the official authorities, because this is the way it goes almost in every country. So you do have special textbooks which teach you about the history of Cyprus. And in those textbooks, you see mostly positive narrative. You see famous heroes, you see famous battles, you see famous, reformers, you see famous archbishops. I have visited exactly the day before yesterday, right? Archbishop's residence. So, famous archbishop, for example. So those heroes are heroes for a whole nation. So those heroes are not only your heroes individually, but those are heroes of the whole Cypriot nation. So that is collective memory. It is very interesting because you have never, you did not leave maybe, 2,000 years ago, right? So you might believe some things about your nation without questioning. Okay, I never lived in that era, so how do I know that this is, yes, someone is writing that in, 3,000 years BC, but do I really think that this can be true? Most of us are just reading those textbooks and we accept those people. Haven't you ever had, and I'm sure Cyprus has national heroes, right? That have no fault. So those are so big, those are humans, those are human figures, and human figures do not exist without a fault, right? But if you look at the history, a lot of times in Georgia, for example, we do have one king, David IV the Builder, which is, super great, super big. He is the most amazing. And then there is a slight problem with him because he was basically he liked to fight. He liked bloody, affairs, etc. He killed his opposition. He destroyed his opposition in the country. Yes. At the same time, he united the country, and at the same time, he created the unity of Georgia, and he won the battle against the enemy, which is the legendary battle. So we have a statue of him. We have he is the superhero for Georgians, right? That's a historical figure that really existed. But the problem is when we teach or when we study, we don't necessarily study that this guy was a harsh guy. This guy didn't like oppositional ideas. He was very far from democracy, because what democracy are we talking about in the 11th century? Especially in Middle Ages Georgia, right? That would not happen. So in that way, we avoid talking about something, but at the same time, he is the national hero for everyone, almost everyone. If you visit Georgia and you ask them who was the the most prominent historical figure, most probably they will tell you either about David the Builder, or they will, and his nickname became Builder, of course, And the second person they might name is the first king woman in Georgian history, not a queen, but rather a king, that is King Tamar. And, you know, a lot of times people will tell, oh, King Tamar, because that was golden era of Georgian history. But at the same time, no one likes to mention that King Tamar was not that, you know, she was a very strong ruler, but she had her faults because she was a human, right? So we don't like to talk about those things. We like to only pinpoint those positive characteristics in the heroes that actually make them so great for all of us. And may God save you if you will say something very negative about those historical heroes. So if you take the person who is the symbol, for example, of Cyprus, right? And you say that, okay, but he was a human, so most probably he also had some faults. He could not be ideally good, all right? There was a famous example. It was studied a couple of years ago, actually, that a lot of nations in Europe, they still believe that they are descendants of the ancient kings. For example, for Sweden, it was actually, they sincerely believe that they are really related to Gustav Vasa, which was a Middle Ages king. And he was a dictator. But I would like to say that Swedes actually say that he was a dictator. For us, this is a little bit different. So for Georgians, it's, you know, it's not that easy to touch negative sides of very famous heroes in history. So you look at your own culture, maybe it might be true for you as well, right? Because depending on how did you study history or what did you study in the history, right? Did you study that Cyprus was always a very democratic land and it had no problems and it had no, you know, the people who governed Cyprus were unfaulty, right? In such case, you understand that you are actually studying something that is more ideological, rather than if you study the fact that this person had a fault, but at the same time, he did a lot of amazing things, right? That is all of us. That is a human nature. So yes, both should be underlined in order to have a little bit more, you know, unclouded vision of the personalities. But if you do have the same and common understanding of the notions, the same person, historical hero, or the same battle can be, you know, representative of your country's history, as well as the opposite can be true also. You know, some countries have, some nations have a very strong feeling of the tragedy. For example, those would be Jews and Holocaust, right? So it is so tied to the Jewish history and Jewish memory. Even if you talk to a new generation who does not remember Holocaust at all, they are still considering it as their national trauma, right? So something that defines their national politics in life, regardless of whether they remember Holocaust or not. So yeah, the mindset of collective memory works like this. It is a collective mindedness. And it's so interesting because, you know, nowadays, especially young generation like you, people like to say, oh, but we are so individualistic. We don't consider anything that is, you know, targeted by the ideology. We are very objective. We are different. But at the same time, I always say this example, when you go to YouTube, right, if you're so different, you go to YouTube and most probably a lot of you have watched something that has been watched by billions of people. I always bring the example of this video, Despacito, right, the song. And this might not be your favorite song, but a couple of years ago, most of you have watched it because 1 billion people have watched it. Not because it is your favorite genre, or not because you are, you know, thriving in that genre or you dance on it or something. No, just because of the peer pressure. So if you look at collective memory, it is something similar as a peer pressure. But in a sense, in collective memory, you are comfortable. You don't think about, okay, I'm thinking as everyone else and I'm following a pattern. What I'm trying to process here is that collective memories work for every society. And in most of the societies, people do not understand how they go in the collective memory pattern. So it is something that is given to you from your school period, maybe from your family period. Those are the values, the judgments, part of culture, part of your thinking, and the values that your thinking is based on. So this is true for all of us, including, of course, our target countries, Georgia and Russia, that we are going to speak about, right? So the hypothesis of, the first, let's say, questions that come up, of course, we need to understand the goal of the, perception. So why is the same event perceived differently by two different cultures? Like, what is going on there? Then what methods were used by the politicians to connect the present events with the past? Because it's a very common strategic move. And maybe also in Cyprus elections, you have come across this. Politicians often, in their speech, mention that they would like to return the old glory, or they would like to, so they use necessarily some type of historical example. It is something like Trump's, Make America Great Again, which is very, very obvious connection. So there should be some type of the past memory or past person or past event that comes in the speech. And that is where you actually detect that something is going on. So that's not exactly, that means that this speech is for the wider audiences and not only for you, of course. And most probably, and I would tell you that in 99% of cases, when you look at the policymakers' speeches, and we will see also, George W. Bush's inaugural speech today. So when you look at the speeches, you will see that every high-level politician goes in the past and they necessarily use some historical example. It's so wild, but they go and, they might remember something from Middle Ages. They might remember something from Second World War. They might remember something from the First World War. So it's a remote past, right? It is a very old, ancient things that happen, but they necessarily bring it up in their speech. And you might not, when you listen to them, you might not exactly detect, but that is where the communication studies come in, right? So that is what you need to learn to be a specialist in the end. So when we create a speech, when the politicians create a speech, right, there are several parts of the speech act. You will meet speeches which do not have all parts. You will meet speeches that have all parts. So it depends on what type of speech are you handling. But so first of all, it can be apologizing. It depends on the situation. But for example, if it is necessary, right? For example, country goes into the war. So the decision maker comes, like president, for example, prime minister, comes out and says, I apologize for not foreseeing this, or I apologize for not, I apologize, I'm sorry for all the lives that have been lost. Like, does it help? No, right? But it's a strategic move to make people listen to you when the situation is really, really hard. So that's number one. Promising. It can be, we are here to improve the situation. That is a plan, but it's more like a promise, right? So it's like planning, but a little bit more hopeful planning. So it's not exactly, let me send 5,000 soldiers on the border. No, it's like, we need to protect our land. We need to do everything to protect our land. This is like common sentence often that you will meet. So this means that you are promising something to the nation, right? You're promising something to the people. Ordering is another part. For example, when the policymakers build a speech, they often say, what do we have to do in order to protect our land? And then they tell you what they need to do, What do you need to do? Which is so weird because, they ask a question often, they say, what is left for us to do? And then they tell you, we need to go into the war. So it's order, but indirect order. So they don't necessarily tell, oh, now you need to take a weapon and fight. No, they tell you we need to protect our motherland. But land is actually people, right? Or who needs to protect the land? People. So that is actually what the ordering is. It can be very indirect, but it can be also direct. We will see, I think the example of, indirect orders can be seen, especially now in the United States, when people say, you need to vote, go and vote. Those are politicians often telling people, right, addressing their senators, for example, addressing their state, you need to go and vote. That is an order. That's not just, just an emotional roller coaster. So when you listen to the politicians' speeches, you need to understand that there are plenty of people working on them the days before the speech will be actually delivered. So it is very carefully planned, including the intonations, where to go up, where to go down, right? Answering the question, it is a very famous speech of George W. Bush Jr. In 2003, when, right before there was a decision made to, deploy the NATO and the United States forces in Iraq, he has made a speech, and he says something like this: who is to be blamed in the terroristic attack? So he asks a question, and then he answers himself. Of course, terroristic groups. So this is the typical, it's also very commonly used strategy when, the leader or political representative asks a question, and then they answer it themselves, right? Request, of course, go to the elections. Its indirect order can be considered as a request. Complaining is oftentimes done by the opposition when they complain about the current government. Also, complaining is often done by the presidents who are in the war. For instance, Zelensky is complaining in his speech often about the lives that are lost, and often he says about nowadays he's also complaining about the Europe and US who have a little bit diminished their attention towards Ukraine, which is impermissible, and I agree with that. On the other hand, Putin is also complaining in his speeches. He often complains that there was a big conspiracy, and in this conspiracy, US and UN are together, are together. And that there is Mother Russia, poor Mother Russia, that is attacked constantly throughout the centuries. So both of them are complaining, but about different things. Warning. This is a very special one. If you would look at Zelensky's and also Georgia's Saakashvili's speeches in 2008, you would see that a lot of them are warning. They often say, if we lose this war, then this war will not stop. If we lose this conflict, then this person or the country aggressor will not stop only on us. They will also continue. That is a warning, right? It's a threat which the leaders try to show you in order to make you assured that this is going to happen. Inviting help, inviting aid, inviting military resources, etc. So we need help. So you can, send this and send that. Refusing, that is oftentimes aggressors' language. So for example, if there is aggression and then, they need to somehow justify their actions, they often say, we did not attack anyone. We were just protecting. I will remind you 2014, when the Crimean annexation happened, so when the crisis happened in Crimea, the Russian position, and Lavrov's position especially, was that we are not attacking anyone. We are protecting the citizens who have Russian passports. So we are just protecting. And that is a refusal to be aggressor, refusal to be an attacker. You might have a question, what's the problem with that, right? I mean, if I am an attacker and if I have an ambition, why can't I just say, like, I have an ambition, I want to, invade everyone. Well, I think it has more something to do with the psychological aspect, because then people might not follow. So if you say that I have an aggression and I have an ambition and I want this land, I don't think that many people can actually follow you. But if you say instead that you want to free those people who suffer, those brothers who suffer, then much more people can be, attracted to the war. So that is a very peculiar segment, of course, and congratulating, depending on, especially if we have speeches after the elections, post-electoral speeches, they often congratulate nation to make a correct choice. Have you ever noticed that? When the politicians come out and they say, oh, thank you for voting, thank you that you made this choice for our improved future. That's a very general sentence, but they congratulate people, they congratulate you for voting correctly. And that's a winner speech as a rule. So example, this is the inaugural speech of George W. Bush Jr. And you do have here, of course, it's divided in segments because we do divide sometimes in segments, which is assertive sentence, which is commissive sentence, which is expressive sentence, right? But just so you will see how those parts work. For example, you have President Clinton, distinguished guests, and my fellow citizens, peaceful transfer of authority is rare in history. So that is a little bit of assertion, but at the same time, there is reference to the past because President Clinton is the past president, right? Yet common in our country. So that is also reference to the past and to the other contrast to the other countries, because the president says, okay, this is not the tradition to transfer power peacefully, but it's for us, for the United States. So that means we are kind of special, right? So that's an underlining of being very distinguished as a nation with distinguished features. With the simple oath, we affirm old traditions and make new beginnings, right? As I said, promise. Oath is a promise, right? So he says that now I'm taking a promise, and we say that all traditions are good, reference to the past, but we can make the new beginnings also. So that's a hopeful thinking, right? As I begin, I thank President Clinton for his service to our nation, being thankful. That was the part of the speech that we have seen just now, right? So that's in action. How does it look? And I thank Vice President Gore for a contest conducted with spirit and ended with grace. We speak here about elections. So 2 thank yous in the beginning of the speech. America at its best is also courageous. So here you have the statement, so the assertion that America is just the greatest country, right? So which is partially also wishful thinking and also a little bit more maybe ordering. Our national courage has been clear in times of depression and war. Reference to the past times or reference to the past examples such as depression and the war is here. When defending common dangers, defined our common goods. Now we must choose if the example of our fathers and mothers will inspire us or condemn us. And here comes the order and also request. So now we must choose if the example of our fathers and mothers will inspire us. So this is the choice of the nation. So President tells that now it's your time to choose, basically, which is indirect order or request, if you wish. We must show courage in a time of blessing by confronting problems instead of passing them on to the future generations. And answer, right? He doesn't ask any question, but he is very assertive. There he says, we must show courage. No one, he doesn't ask, should we show courage? Is it what we want? No, he says, we must show the courage and confront problems. So confront or fight with the problems, right? So this is approximately a very small extract from inaugural speech, and you can see many such speeches in, of course, in history and in internet also. And you can look at all the signs of the speech building, and you can adjust and see which targets of the speech building, which parts of the speech building are actually present in the speech that is interesting for you. So about case though, about Georgia and Russia. So Georgian narratives generally, right? So Georgian version of events. I would say historically, taking the textbooks of Georgian history, looking at them, you would draw some of the idea of how Georgians perceive the situation all the time. Let's say 99% of cases, because 99% of cases we were actually conquered. So that's a fact that we were conquered, right? So we lost freedom, we lost wars in Middle Ages because we were a small country always, right? I think there are maybe very few attacking wars that Georgia actually had in the frames of its existence. But other than that, we mostly had the wars where we protected ourselves. So Georgian narrative is built around such sentences. I don't know, you can also look at the Cyprus narrative for your country, of course. But we have here the narrative that Georgia exists as a small country, and we always like to underline, always, that is in politics and culture, always, that we are strategically on a very important place. So we are located between Europe and Asia. We were part of the Silk Road, and that is the biggest, I think the biggest virtue that we see in our geographical location. So oftentimes Georgians use this argument to justify why so many invaders used to come to our territory and conquer us. So a lot of times when you visit Georgia, you will hear speech, we were always conquered by the bigger nations because we have strategical location, right? We don't know whether it is true or no. I mean, I can't go in 5th century and ask Persians why did they conquer us, or 7th century and ask Arabs why they conquered us, right? So, and then Russians, why did you conquer us? So it doesn't work like that. But that is interesting narrative, let's say, pattern that you can meet in every case when people speak about the wars in Georgia. Second statement, which is also very characteristic, Georgia is constantly attacked by strong enemies which try to destroy its independence. And that is a very peculiar thing because Georgian narrative is purely built on the idea of protection of independence, which is so important. We have a value, national value, which is a freedom. So freedom is our national value. You know, there are countries in the world for whom freedom is just a given fact, right? So they don't feel that this is a value that needs to be protected. For Georgians, however, freedom is a value that needs to be protected. So it's a very strong, very, very strong value that we have. So that is why we always say that our enemy wanted to take our independence. Let me say it like that. You might say that, okay, this is logical, right? But on the other hand, when you conquer a territory, in Middle Ages especially, of course you are taking their independence. Then what does that mean to conquer a territory? How do you conquer territory otherwise? If they still have independence and if they still can make their own choices, right? So that is natural. So attack and let's say conquest, generally conquest, always goes with, you know, taking independence and freedom from the country. I mean, that's natural. That's how it goes generally, right? So Georgia is not an exception there. It's rather a common rule that when one country invades another country, the country that has been invaded loses its independence and freedom. So it's not exclusive for Georgia, I want to say, but Georgians like to make it also a little bit more exclusive for themselves. So we often say, oh, every invader that came to our land was fighting against our kings, they were fighting against our society, they wanted us to become, you know, Persians, Arabs, Russians, Mongols, etc. So that's the deal. And next one is pretty interesting as well. Georgians do not obey the situation. This is a very common narrative. you will not find, I think, any Georgian who will tell you that, oh, we obeyed situation 1 or 2 times. No, never. Georgian narrative is built on the idea that we always fought. So even when we were conquered, we always used to fight against the big bad wolf, right? So whether that wolf was, again, Persians, Arabs, Turks, Mongols, Russians, it did not matter. Actually, all of them came to Georgia, right? The thing is, Georgian narrative likes to underline that we have a fighter spirit. So we always fought. It is in our blood, people say, that we didn't obey the situation. I can say that there is a logic drawing from the history. Of course, we have a history of wars, but at the same time, I would like to say that Mongols stayed on the territory of Georgia for quite some time. And yes, there were some rebellions, but at the end of the day, they stayed in Georgia for a long time. So how is that possible if all Georgians did not obey to the situation, right? So that would not be possible. Then we would not exist as a nation. So sometimes Georgians used to fight against the invaders, but there were periods when they just could not fight, and that is completely okay as well, right? So, but we like to underline that we never ever gave up. That's a very common notion. And also, final idea that we often process in our narrative is that we defend our independence and we regain freedom always, and we establish European democracy because this is what we want. So Georgian narrative is built on the idea that we are on the good strategic locations, everyone wants to conquer us, so we never make mistakes. So it's we who are victims. So we have a victim narrative that says that we are victims of big powers that arrive in Georgia. And we always fight. By the way, we never use diplomacy for some reason, right? So we always fight. That is our narrative. We do not obey the situation, and by fighting, we defend our independence. We regain freedom in every case because, yes, we were conquered by Persians, we regained independence by Arabs, we regained independence by Mongols, it was the same, etc. So even by Russians, right? But again, the same. So we regained independence. And what now we are trying to do, it is that we are trying to establish European democracy. This is a very classical Georgian narrative template. Of course, there might be some other things which, I have missed or a lot of other scholars have missed, but this is how we see our narrative in many ways. Now about the Russian narrative, couple of words there. First of all, we go to announcements of Georgian president. On August 12, 2008, we talk about the address of Mikhail Saakashvili. So again, if we look back just a second, so Georgia exists as a small country. Georgia is constantly attacked. We do not obey the situation, and we regain freedom. That's the basic thing. Now look at the speeches. So you have a speech here on 12th of August. So the war is like almost a week on by 12th of August. And that is the moment when ceasefire agreement is being, formed and is being talked about. So fighting of Georgians with Russians is the fighting with biblical David with Goliath. David is small, Goliath is big, right? But there was another very strange, I would say very religious link. It's a beautiful link though. I appreciate the drama here because biblical David has a protection of the God, right? And Goliath is a bad guy. Let's say evil guy, but biblical David is protected. We do have also this, a little bit of narrative of religious importance that we are protected by the God because we were, God's land or something similar. So we do have this biblical reference here, which is quite interesting, right? The second is exactly the first point of the narrative template, which says that Georgia is on a strategic location, right? So according to our president, Georgia is a harbinger border between kind and evil. So kind in this case is Europe, and evil is, of course, is Russia. So that strategic location is underlined, but technically, let's say, like a little bit delicately, but it is underlined. And you see also dramatization. So kind is one side, which is European side. And you know, it's a little bit, of course, generalization. You would say that compared to Russia, Europe is kind. But again, not every country in Europe is equally kind, right? So Europe is not homogeneous. Europe has its own countries that are interested, countries that are not interested, countries that stay neutral, or they even, you know, might sympathize to the Russian Federation. So that's not exactly all of them are kind. But in this speech, it was so. And then comes, I want to tell you that during the 5 days of confrontation, Russia's reputation was tarnished. That's the idea which template says that we have fought and we have regained our freedom and protected our independence. And then comes my favorite part. Look at that. Pretty much like 1939 in the War of Finland. So basically, the reference is done to the Second World War. And suddenly, out of nowhere, Finland appears, right, in the speech, because Finland is a small country. Finland had a war with Russians. So that is something that was very much, you know, targeted. Historical example. Historical example, maybe not the same, you know, we don't have any success historical examples, but like there is a historical example of Finland that has been used very skillfully. And I like the last one also very much, that is Sukhumi and Srimali became Jerusalem for Georgian people. Collective memory. This is a collective memory, right, in action, because the president tried to address the people and say that Jerusalem might be lost, but it is never forgotten. That's the very, also very, you know, indirect reference, but it's a good reference. I like it, actually. It's very effective. So Jerusalem is a holy land, right? So when Jerusalem was lost, the holy land was lost, the people remembered it. Jews remembered their Jerusalem for many centuries until they came back. And it's not accidental reference, of course, because Jerusalem is the land which was regained by the people, right, of Jews. So that means that our president made a reference that Sukhumi and Srimali, which are two occupied territories even nowadays, will come back one day, like Jerusalem went back to Jewish nation. But again, the reference is also another, that Jerusalem was never forgotten, so we should not forget Sukhumi and Srimali. Right? So this is a very strategic, a very good reference, double, let's say with the double meaning. Now we will look at the Russian narrative. Now look at this narrative, and then you can also Google a little bit, I think, today, if you will be very interested, of course, about how Russian policy makers actually talk about the war of Ukraine, and you might find a little bit of commonality in their narrative in 2008, 2014, and 2020. So Russian template always starts with the fact that Russia does not disturb anyone. So Russia is calm, according to Russians. It is just big, and it is just there. So it does not disturb anyone. It is not interested in anyone's affairs. Suddenly, all of a sudden, it always is some type of a conspiration, but suddenly problematic situation is created, and Russia is attacked by enemies. Or Russians are attacked by them. So either nation is attacked, Russians, or Russia as a country is attacked by enemies. At first, and that's also very interesting because Georgians have a victim narrative, right? So Georgians are attacked all the time. But Russian narrative is also a victim narrative because Russians say, oh, we don't do anything bad. This is we who are attacked. So it's a victim against victim. So then who is aggressor, right? If both of them are victims, then what is happening? So at first, and this is actually always like that. This is, I don't know, this is some type of, is that a reference to the god, or I don't know. But this is, at first, Russia loses the war. You would find this starting from Crimean War of 1853. That is what Russian historians often write, that the first stage of the war is lost. So at first, Russia is losing, like in the movies of, you know, if you like adventure, no, action movies, right? When there is a final fight between the heroes, and then the hero starts to win, and then at some point he starts to lose, or she. So the main protagonists, they start to lose, and then they come back suddenly, right? So that's a common template also of the action movies, right? So for example, Mission Impossible, or I don't know. So the guy is beaten up, the main hero, and then he comes back, like rises from ashes like a phoenix or something similar, right? So in Russia, the same narrative exists. So the first stage of Russia, like first stage of war, is always that Russia is losing the war and is threatened by losing its independence and welfare. And then here comes a very interesting link, because they always say that, okay, first we will lose the war, but then because we have historic mission of peacekeeping, because we have the protection of the divine forces. And if you look at the Russian propaganda music, which I would love to discuss, but we don't have enough opportunities, enough time. But if you listen to Russian propaganda music right now, the guy called Shaman, the young person who is actually very, very propagandized in Russia during the war, his lyrics, one of his songs says, we have the protection of the God. And that's a common narrative as well for them, that because they have historic mission to keep peace, and they have the protection of the divine, they alone, and that's also very important. Russians do not like to mention any allies that they have during the conflict. So they always say Russia alone manages to defeat the enemy and save its own independence, which is a little bit weird because this narrative also circulates nowadays. In one of the songs, which is quite popular in Russia at this moment, the lyric says, we need to protect our freedom. From what? Russia is not attacked. So why is it a threat to Russian freedom? Right? But that is, again, that is propaganda. That is what the narrative template does. It creates enemy from the other. Even if you attack them, you can still create enemy from them and still make them, you know, threats for your freedom and independence, which is an interesting phenomenon. And of course, we do have announcements of Russian politicians. Same August 12, and this is done on purpose because I want you to see. So Georgian narrative on 12th of August and the Russian narrative on 12th of August. And what is happening there? Oh, this is fun. It's not fun, of course. We are talking about the war that took lives of a lot of people. But looking at this propaganda machine is fun, I want to tell you, because it starts by, that is Lavrov. Let me begin by explaining why we entered on the territory of Georgia. So that was, you know, the mode is a little bit aggressive, so a little bit apologetic, because at first they try to explain of why did they enter our territory. And they say it black and white that they have entered our territory, right? I have explained militaristic aspect many times. Now let's remember the Second World War. This is crazy because looking at the Georgian president's speech, he also remembers 1939, Second World War. Russians also do the same. And those speeches were delivered almost at the same time. So there is very less chance that they would know about each other's speech before, right? So they psychologically, or maybe by accident, they start to use the same era, the same historical example. And then it continues. On September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany attacked Poland. Reference is that Georgia is a Nazi Germany. I want you to know that there has been almost the same speech in Russia right now, a couple of months ago, that proclaimed that Ukrainians are similar to Nazi Germany. So that's a common example. That was the same for us. That is the same for Ukrainians. So that example stays the same, which is very interesting, actually. So Nazi Germany attacked Poland in 1941. They attacked Soviet Union. How should the Soviet Union react? Do you think they needed to stay neutral? This is a crazy example because, first of all, we don't talk about Soviet Union, we talk about Russian Federation. So I often say, and I even have articles that deal with this situation, but if people reacted earlier, if people in Europe or in Western societies would react sharply to this situation, to these speeches, we most probably would not get what we receive now. Because actually from this speech you understand that the leaders of Russian Federation still believe that Russian Federation is a Soviet Union, which it is not. So, but the pattern of thought, like thinking, and the propaganda they offer says that they think like Soviet Union did. They act like Soviet Union did, right? Which is not exactly the same situation. And then it continues. Georgian peacekeepers opened fire on the Russian peacekeepers with whom they are supposed to work together to carry out their mission of maintaining peace in the region. So here we go. There is someone who attacks suddenly. All of a sudden, Georgian peacekeepers wake up one day. So this follows very much the road of the narrative template that we have seen, that one day, suddenly, they just wake up and they attack Georgian peacekeepers. If you look at Russian speeches in relation to Ukraine, right, you will still say the same, you will still see the same pattern. The pattern is that one day, they have, woken up and one day Ukrainians started to attack Russia. Well, this is a sudden attack, right? Yeah, Maria is writing that it's not only a Russian narrative. The Nazi Ukraine is something that people all over the world are thinking. I do not know who else who else can be the one who is thinking exactly like that. Because, well, I don't know if they, maybe some people are sharing that opinion, but I would say that on the policymaker levels, I would not say that there are a lot of countries definitely that are thinking like that. So, right, I don't have any information of how many people actually refer to Ukraine as a Nazi one, but it's interesting because the narrative is Nazi Ukraine and it is created by Russians and not by the other countries. They might share it, like in Georgian case, a lot of countries also shared the opinion that Georgians were faulty. So Russians have a very strong hybrid war strategy, which is, by doing a lot of things. At the same time, attacking multiple social networks, multiple web pages, etc. Right? So yeah, again, exactly. So this Nazi Ukraine, it is created by Russia, but it is widespread. The same happened for Georgians, absolutely. But the thing is, it comes from Russia, and every country that somehow opposes Russian domination or tries to, protect itself, they necessarily become Nazi one day, which is also weird because if there was a Nazi country, why wasn't there any thought before? So why did we suddenly go into the weapons, right? Which is also very, no one speaks about it because they don't want to speak about it because then they will need to answer. And the answer is that, okay, one day we just discovered that they became Nazi, okay? But people do not become Nazi in a day, right? Or country policymakers do not become Nazi in a day. So that is a little bit, so this sudden moment that suddenly Russia sees that some country became Nazi and they are suddenly killing people, and then suddenly Russia decides to protect them, that is also a little bit of their template, right? So bad people, Russia is fighting against bad people to stop them. That is the most important for them. And well, the same was in Georgian case, because they said that Georgian peacekeepers one day woke up and they have attacked the Russian peacekeepers, and they actually needed to work together, but they, you know, instead of that, they have attacked them. And then, so yeah, so the conclusion, as a way of conclusion, because we are rather, you know, close to the finishing line, we say that of the tools that have been used in both conflicts in 1939, right, the Second World War example, the tool was the same. So even if you are dealing with the different cultures, the reference was the same. Even if in Georgian case it was the War of Finland, and in Russian case it was the Nazi Germany attacking Poland, which according to their logic, Ossetia is a Poland. So in that case, you would see that both of them refer to the same historical argument of 1939, but in different ways. Both cultures show themselves as victims, and that is very interesting. I think that that's the most interesting point, because so when you show yourself as a victim, right, of the situation, you assert that the other side is aggressive. But Russians often assert that we are victims, but at the same time we protect ourselves. And what can we do? We are strong. You know, that's approximately their excuse. After all, they call themselves bear, right? Russian bear. So they believe that they are strong but peaceful, which is not the case for the other countries, of course. Recollection of historical events with a similar enemy. So that is a little bit, you know, when Georgians remember the political speeches are, you know, taking place, they are remembering often Russians as enemies. You know, they are like, we need to develop against Russians. For example, nowadays there are demonstrations in Georgia regarding the law, special legislation or, you know, conflict happens in Georgia, and they call it a Russian law, because it is unacceptable for the democratic society of Georgia. So people dislike it. People dislike it, that is equal to Russian law. So the radicalization of the other is quite high, because we don't like something, it is Russian, which is also interesting, right? Conspiracy of aggressive countries, this is Russian actually. So Russians often say that there was a conspiracy that takes place against them, and sometimes it is European Union, sometimes that is US, sometimes that is, you know, Russian propaganda often mentions other Western countries and other Western unions that are very much threatful for them. The need of military self-defense, it is totally Russian concept. They say that they don't want to have any problem, but if problem arrives, they are ready to answer. And military answer, it's not diplomatic answer, it's not talking, it's not what other countries generally do, but it's rather a military answer, which is also, it is in their template. So it makes me think a little bit that when you are dealing with the Russian Federation, it's almost impossible to have a diplomacy with them, because they already tell you that my cross-cultural competence is zero. I do not want to talk to you because I'm chosen nation. You are the one who is aggressive against me. You are the one who goes in the conspiracy against me. So I'm not going to talk to you. I am going to attack you, right? So that is the template. That means that none of the country's leaders or the policymakers should count on very close diplomatic cooperation with Russian Federation based on their template, based on their assertion that the need of military self-defense will always exist for them at this moment, especially, of course, like looking from today's perspective. The concept of chosen nation is for both of us. For Russians, they are chosen nation. That is why they win wars. For Georgians, we are chosen war. We are also chosen nation. And you know why? Because we managed to stay independent. That's a wild one. So Georgian narrative does not like to underline that there was Nicolas Sarkozy who was, flying back and forth with the 12 points of ceasefire agreement. Rather, it was the bravery of Georgian nation and the concept that we are, chosen nation and that we cannot be conquered so easily. So at one point, there was this absurd situation when both countries, policymakers of both countries in Georgia and in Russia, on 13th of August, they came out and they said, we won the war. So for Georgian policymakers, they won the war. For Russian policymakers, they won the war. So who won the war? And here comes the issue of how we interpreted winning the war. So for Georgians, winning the war was, again, based on our narrative template. Winning the war was maintaining independence. So yes, we lost territories. Yes, we paid price. This is our interpretation of the August War. We paid very big price, but we have managed to, keep our independence. And for Russian narrative, they won the war because they have conquered, but they have occupied territories. And they don't say we won the war because we occupied territories. Rather, they say we have won the war because we have stopped Georgian aggression, which is also wild, So they say, yeah, we won the war because our job, our mission was to keep peace, and we stopped Georgia that was aggressive. So what we did, we kept peace. That means we won the war. So if you look at the fact-based history, right, and you will ask, okay, so who won the war? You might not have an answer on that about when it comes to 2008 August War, because both countries, both cultures, Georgian and Russian, defines this war in their own way. And the result of this war is actually dependent on how they propagandize what is their narrative given to the people. So Georgians understand that we lost territory, we have IDPs, we have internally displaced community, we have refugees, etc. So that's one side of the story, but on the other hand, we managed to keep independence, which is a victory in that situation when Russians could actually conquer us militarily, because we were weak, basically. And for Russians, though, it is a winning of the war, even if they needed to sign 12-point ceasefire agreement with Nicolas Sarkozy. And we had US support, verbal support, especially. Georgia had that. So Russians needed to sign that agreement, not to go into the full-scale aggressor mode. But at the same time, they have their excuse to say that they have won the war. So it's a little bit strange situation, because in 2008 it's unclear who won the war in the end, right? And then we often say, of course, there is a little bit of a material that you can read and get to know a little bit more. But we say that there are certain, again, steps that are taken in Russian policymakers' narratives, and generally, of course, those are the steps that you see, 7 steps. Those are, they generally accumulate and prepare mass media in advance. So they start to flow, propaganda videos, propaganda ideas, propaganda, a little bit more propaganda than generally. They use the language of hatred in order to, Nazi Ukraine, Nazi Georgia, Nazistic, they do not stop, they do not speak, they only look at the weapon. That is a constant thing as well. Negative image of the country, so they try to create negative image of the country, and they say often that this country is attacking its own citizens. You would see that in the case of Georgia, in the case of Ukraine. Enemy is not alone. That is always underlined very clearly, that it's not alone. that Ukraine is working against us. It's not the fact that Georgians were working alone against us. They were puppets. Lavrov made in his 12 August speech that Georgians were puppets in the hands of the Western world, and he referred to USA. And comparing the enemy to other historical evil forces, Nazi Germany is Russia's favorite, and their narrative is dominant, and it has not changed for many years now. So if they say about the country that it is Nazi Germany country, that's done deal. Okay, so then we are getting ready for the war. Reminding population about the constant threats. So they often remind people, okay, you know, you have to be ready because this country is evil and they might attack us. And showing that enemy is not alone, and there is a wider conspiracy. That's also one of the methods that they often deploy. We have references. Thank you for your attention, and I want to show you a video. And that is a very peculiar video. It follows Russian narrative a little bit, so I hope you will enjoy it. I don't know if you will enjoy it in the end of the. I don't know if you will enjoy it in the end of the day, but it definitely has its logic, and the video was created after the 2008 August war, and it has Russian inscriptions, but I think that you will still understand what is going on. The video says, "I am aggressor," and then the video says that Russia is not actually an aggressor, but if someone attacks Russia, they are going to answer. So that is a very, very peculiar. That's why I want you to maybe have an opportunity to look at it.
Я русский оккупант. Это моя профессия. Так сложилось исторически. Когда-то я оккупировал Сибирь. Теперь там добывают нефть, газ, алюминий, еще много полезного. Теперь там города с детскими садами и больницами. Теперь там нельзя продавать женщин завязанную свою шкуру. Я оккупировал Прибалтику, где упирается строить заводами и электростанциями. Прибалтика делала высококлассную радиотехнику и автомобили, ставила слухами и пальцами. Меня попросили оттуда уйти. Теперь там добывают шкоты, а часть населения чистит унитазы в блоках. Я оккупировал Среднюю Азию. В степях я построил каналы, заводы, космодромы, больницы и стадионы. Там строили космические ракеты и самолеты, развивали промышленность, выращивали пшеницу и хлопок для всей страны. Меня попросили оттуда уйти. Теперь там развивают американские кредиты и выращивают коноплян, а часть населения уехала работать на стройке бывших оккупантов. Я оккупировал Украину. Вместе с украинцами я строил один двигателей, корабли, танки и автомобили. Меня попросили оттуда уйти. Теперь там разрушают все, что осталось от оккупанта. При этом там не стоит ничего нового, кроме бесконечных майданов и диктатуры. Да, я оккупант, и я устал извиняться за это. Я оккупант по праву рождения. Я агрессор и кровожадный урод. Бойтесь, это я терпел зверство польских интервентов во времена смуты. Но чем закончилась их интервенция? Это я всю Москву, чтобы не отдать Наполеону. Как закончил Наполеон? Это я сидел в группе голландцев, понимая, что нацистов удержать не получится. Здесь есть нацисты, где их проклятый Гитлер. Ко мне домой приходили все людей. Турки, англичане, поляки, немцы, французы. Земли хватило на всех. По 2,5 литра на каждого. Поймите, мне не нужна ваша лицемерная свобода. Мне не нужна ваша гнилая демократия. Мне чувствует все, что вы называете западными ценностями. У меня другие интересы. И что вы предупреждаете в последний раз. Не волнуйтесь, я строю мир. Я люблю мир. Воевать я умею лучше всех. С уважением, русский оккупант.
So the video shows the message to the world leaders, and it includes reference to Napoleon, to Hitler, and to Soviet Union, and it mentions all the milestones of the conquest, and it says that when the Russians occupied those territories were having the best time of their life, but now they have democracy, false ideas that need to be taken care of. And this video is quite old, actually. I think that is one of the very good examples of what exists in internet and what circulates in Russian society as the propaganda video, in order to make people assured that Russia wants peace, because that's the last line, that Russia wants peace, it wants to build peace, but we know how to fight the best. Yeah, thank you for your attention. Now I'm ready to answer your questions, if there are any, of course.
Nino, thank you very much for another great and highly stimulated lecture on this extremely interesting and topical issue. I think it's a repeated motive in all wars. The first victim of every war is the truth. A statement.
Yeah. Truth is very subjective, but yeah, we try to give an account of different positions, and I am happy if that will help in further critical analysis during the course.
Certainly. I have only one question. I would like to ask you whether you think that the modern landscape of social media, of the internet, of the internationalization of information can help the citizens, can help the people to defend themselves against the propaganda of others and of their own governments sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. There are fact-checking opportunities nowadays more than before, of course. There are special agencies working on the propaganda, detection and somehow saying what is propaganda and what is not, what is relative truth, of course. So technological help is available. But I would say that I think more and more European countries also need to understand the value of the experts and of those people who can actually educate the wider population. Right now, this education happens in the space of academia, so professors are giving knowledge to you guys or the students, and then you give the knowledge to your friends, to your family members, etc. And that is more a word of mouth, right? That is spread. But we hope that maybe in the future there will be even more tools than there are now.
Thank you very much. We had already several comments during your lecture. We have another one by Erato. What do you think is one solution to fight against propaganda and fake news? Education? Should the citizens do their own research and not just rely on the traditional media? Very interesting lecture anyway.
Thank you, Erato. So, right, this is a little bit hard issue. Education would be the first. Education of every citizen is very important. Most probably, and I think the biggest solution to the problem is to make people assured that nothing is set in stone. So when policymaker or someone of authority figure says something, it does not mean that it is 100% true. So we should not blindly follow people, but rather educate ourselves about the current situation. That's number one. Number two is, of course, asking the experts or reading a lot of material which is available. There are a lot of, for example, scientific articles that exist around almost every topic, right? To understand the overarching points for both or for third parties or communities, etc. And traditional media has still a very big role. Unfortunately or fortunately, I can't say that, I don't know. But in my practice, the countries which I have visited so far, almost whole population says that the first channel or the public channel, right? Almost every state has a channel that is financed by the taxpayers' money. That should be actually their function, to give as much of positions about one issue that happened as possible, because we still understand that nowadays people have no time. So you might be working not in education, you might be working, I don't know, as a doctor. So you don't have enough time to follow that who is saying what, right? So that is actually the job of the media, traditional media to do that. However, more and more nowadays, there are also online channels that help people in that. So, but I would say the best option is the fact check. That's a web page, fact checker. In Georgia, we have fact checker GE, but it depends, of course, on each country, and each country has their own. Yeah, it depends on the age group, absolutely, and that is why I'm saying that traditional media is still very important. It can be, you know, just a public channel, which is financed by the taxpayers' money, and taxpayers have the ability to have a say there. So as a taxpayer, you are the one who is paying the salaries of the public channel workers, let's say employees. So I think that there is a proactive position that social society groups of society should have. So if there is an interest, there is possibility to have more objective and more transparent media. But it should be the first public channel or the channel that is financed by the taxpayers' money. That is important.
If I may also answer Rato's question, there is another way to fight against propaganda and fake news, and this is to study in our master's program.
That was a good PR.
Theory and practice, you will get all necessary tools to subject into critique all possible views from all possible actors. And I know that Rato is one of our students.
She is, right? She is writing, I am the student.
Perfect. I don't know if you have any other questions or comments.
Yeah, just one comment here, because Maria is writing that media can be geared by government. Yes, but then there is also NGO role, and that is where the CSOs and NGOs have the biggest role, because you do have media regulation agencies that work in every state, and their job should be to secure that media is not geared by the government. So that is already the institutionalized approach, which actually you have media regulation agency, and you do have also NGOs and CSOs that work with the media exclusively. So that is where they need to take a proactive action.
At this moment, I would like to encourage you to attend and the other two lectures of Nino tomorrow and the day after. And I would like to thank Nino really for these two amazing lectures, highly interesting topics. And of course, it was a great pleasure to meet you, Nino, and to hear from you all these so interesting issues.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much again. I would like to thank all the friends that were with us yesterday and today. And we are looking forward to having you, Nino, with us also in the future sometime.
Definitely. I'm here 2 more days at least. So.
And in the distant future. Thank you so much. Thank you very much all. Have a nice evening.
Bye.